There's a few groups supporting this socialist project. Venezuela, we are with you in the Sam Gindin chair. Leo Panitch, who doesn't need much of an introduction to this crowd. He's been, an important intellectual on the left for many, an activist for many years, probably longer than he or I want to remember. He's Canada Research Chair in Comparative Political Economy at York University, and a distinguished research professor in political science. And he is the author of Global Capitalism in the American Empire and editor of Socialist Register. Probably, I would say one of the foremost Marxist intellectuals in the world today. So we're very lucky that he has just come back from a seminar that was put on by the MST. The video you saw is from a conference that the MST had, and he's going to talk to you about this extraordinary movement in Brazil, which is, on my mind anyway, probably the most powerful and important social movement in the world, and a model in many ways for the kind of movements we need if we're going to get rid of capitalism, which is what I think we have to do if we want any kind of change. So without any further ado, please welcome Leo. He's going to talk for an hour because there's a lot of information and knowledge he has to bring to us. And then we'll have a discussion and we'll try and wind it up by 9 o'clock, okay? Okay, thanks. Leo.
Well, I very much appreciate you all coming on this hot summer night, and I appreciate the opportunity that the Socialist Project and Judy and her chair and the Venezuela We're With You Coalition gives me to report on this really remarkable and quite significant meeting that was organized by the National Office of the Landless People's Movement in mid-June. It was an international seminar on the perspectives of class struggle in Latin America, which was timed to be held in honor of Che's 80th birthday. It was held from June 16th to 18th at the Fernandez Flores National School of the Landless People's Movement of Brazil, which is 27 kilometers outside of the city of Sao Paulo on a farm. The people invited to the seminar were a select group of what might probably be called Latin America's organic intellectuals. Some 40 intellectuals, activists, researchers in the trade union movement, some leaders from the trade union movements, people in research institutes, people in political organizations, and academics and so forth. 2 or 3 from each country, from Mexico, from Venezuela, from Cuba, from Bolivia, from Argentina, from Paraguay and Uruguay, with 1 person each from Nicaragua, El Salvador, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. And of course from Brazil itself. I was the only person invited from North America. There was 1 person there from Asia, Krista Murtha from the Indian miners movement, 1 from Africa, Ernst Wamba from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and 1 from Europe, Joachim Ball from the Rosa Luxemburg Institute in Berlin. There were 3 days of intensive discussion. The first day devoted to the analysis of the project of capital, crisis, and projects. The second day was devoted to analysis of the situation of power of the working class and the left. And the third day was devoted to challenges and perspectives for the working class and the left. I want to apologize for what's probably going to be the length to present an accurate picture of what took place at this meeting to you, but it really is so remarkable, I really think it's worth it. And if I didn't, I in particular would have had to have left out the most sobering account of what's taking place in Bolivia today that you're likely to hear, given by a Bolivian very closely involved with Hamas and government. What made the meeting so significant was that it encapsulated, and I said this on the 3rd day, towards the end of the discussions, it encapsulated what appears to be a new conjuncture for the world left, in which the Latin American left is once again taking the lead, as it had done in the previous conjuncture. The previous conjuncture was one of networking among social movements. The anti-free trade movements, the anti-globalization movements, the social forums, epitomized, and here you see Latin America's leadership, by the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre and its offspring. It was a conjuncture defined by movements networking to protest the state and capital, to block the state from the outside. It reached its climax, you could say, in the last Mexican national election with the Zapatista abstention campaign from voting in that election. It reached its intellectual climax with John Holloway's Change the World Without Taking Power. The new conjuncture, which again is being led by the Latin American left, shifts towards what we here in Canada have called structured political movements, oriented to not blocking state power and protesting state power, but to contesting state power, to entering the state, to transforming the state as an essential element of transforming society. It's represented by a meeting that, to take the Mexican contrast, a meeting that is being organized, a founding Congress that is being organized in Mexico by activists from the radical elements in the teachers' union who were so important in the Oaxaca uprising. That'll take place this September, and I have a poster here and some material on it if you look at the back table where the Socialist Register is located, which is attempting to articulate social movements into a new structured political movement in Mexico. Of course, it was already, Marcos Tello from the teachers' union played a very important role in this meeting, and he's one of the key organizers of this meeting in Mexico. It was already, of course, encapsulated in the transformation of the MAS in Bolivia from a social movement to a political party. And you could say that even Chavez's current attempt to build a political party in Venezuela reflects it. It isn't confined to Latin America. The emergence of the New Left Party in Germany, Die Linke, represents this as well. And the fact that they explicitly took as their name the left to indicate a break with the third way, with the centrism of the third way. We are the left, we're proud of it, and we'll stand for it. And our politics is about mobilizing in society, in economic and cultural struggles, not only in electoral ones, we'll have to see if they keep to it, reflects the new type of political party they claim to be. Similar developments are occurring in Europe, at least in Greece, where the Popular Alliance of left parties there now holds, as does Die Linke in Germany, 15% of the 16% of the popular vote in opinion. But there's no question that insofar as there's any success in this respect, it's taking place above all in Latin America. So the importance of the meeting was that it focused very richly on how to do this in a creative way. Going beyond the limits not only of past practice and previous theory, but also explicitly trying to go beyond the limits of current practices of the left forces in Latin America. And this included, and this was, I thought, most remarkable and important, trying to develop a new kind of international solidarity. The meeting reflected this new conjuncture in this respect in that it was so different, I felt. Obviously, it was a different type of meeting, but it was so different from the type of international solidarity that went on in Porto Alegre. In Porto Alegre, when arrived there, one of the major events laid on was in the most expensive hotel in the city, a massive and very professionally organized meeting on how remarkable the popular budgeting process in Porto Alegre was. And you were given all of the rosy pictures of its successes, with no discussion of its contradictions and limitations. That's not to say that it wasn't a remarkable development. But that was typical, I found, of the Porto Alegre type of a meeting in the previous conjuncture. And it bore some resemblance for all of the rejection of the proper rejection and creative rejection of the social movements of the old Leninist party practice. It bore some resemblance to the type of international solidarity that was characterized when the Fabians, the Webbs, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, went to the Soviet Union in 1935, in the middle of the show trials, in the middle of the starvation of the peasants, came back to Britain and said, "I've seen the future and it works." This meeting was explicitly characterized by an attempt to lay out all of the problems, to concentrate on the problems that the new conjuncture is throwing up in terms of political organization, to try to learn from one another in terms of the limitations and the barriers and the mistakes, rather than the rosy side of the picture, the accomplishments. It was an international politics then, if you like, of learning from the limitations of the struggles elsewhere, rather than the type of politics that tries to draw inspiration from the successes of the politics elsewhere. To understand the shift in the conjuncture, it is important to appreciate the context, first of all, in which the MST called and held this international seminar. And it's necessary then to say something about the MST's current practice and situation. You, I'm sure, know something about its history, formed in the early to mid-'80s, engaged in a strategy of organizing the landed peasantry into an element, a strong element of the working class according to their definition, and engaging in land occupations with the legal framework available under the Constitution put in place by the military, whereby land that was unused or unproductive or not sufficiently productive, and there was always debates in this in the judiciary, could be brought into public hands and then the occupation could be legalized and the previous landless peasants could begin to farm, whether as individual farmers or family farmers or as cooperatives. It was an enormously successful movement, culturally as well as in terms of this strategy, and had a big impact on the transition from the dictatorship to democracy, and had a big impact on the building of the Workers' Party in Brazil, although it isn't formally part of it. Most of the active members are. Or have.
Leo, could you use the mic?
Sorry, okay, yeah. Sure. From June 9th to June 12th, that is in the week before the seminar was held, the MST carried out what they called a struggle journey to denounce problems caused by the actions of the big companies in Brazil, the big corporations in Brazil, especially foreign ones. In terms of the effects of the agribusiness model, of monoculture, export agriculture, in terms of the effects of neoliberal economic policy, which is sustained by the Lula government, in terms of the speculative practices of multinational corporations and financial capital. Literally dozens of protests were held across the country in 17 states over those 3-4 days, involving anywhere from 500 to 1,500 peasants, or workers, as they often call them. For instance, a sugarcane test station, which was a public-private partnership between 20 of the largest companies in Pernambuco and the University of Pernambuco, was occupied. The genetically engineered samples for sugar production were destroyed, and 200 hectares of sugarcane sown at the station were torn down. A energy distribution center, of a hydroelectric company, and a dam site of a power plant was occupied to protest against the projects for the division of the San Francisco River, with 70% of the diverted water designed to go to agribusiness. The railway of the Vail Mining Company was blocked in 6 or 7 places by different groups of peasants, anywhere again from 500 to 1,500. On the grounds that it endangered peasant lives in terms of interrupting their movement, and on the grounds that it was exporting soy for international markets. Farms were occupied that were responsible for contributing to the policy of ethanol production. In the capital of Sao Paulo, the building of a company responsible for the construction of dam sites that would displace 700 families were occupied, etc., etc. And I could go on and describe probably 20 more such actions. You get the type of sense of the type of movement this is, and its effects and its power. Perhaps the most courageous action was the occupation of Walmart in Porto Alegre to protest against the role that Walmart as an agribusiness commercial distribution corporation plays in this pattern of world agriculture and consumption. It was the most courageous not because it was the most difficult, but because over the course of this year there has been a concerted campaign by the right-wing government of Porto Alegre that was elected of Rio Grande do Sul, the whole state, that was elected and displaced the Workers' Party government, to criminalize and render illegal the MST. In fact, a committee of public prosecutors was specially set up by the governor of Rio Grande do Sul, who was known as the pitbull governor amongst the MST, Yeda Crucius. And they unanimously passed a report that was issued to them, which said that, and this is a quote from it, it's been distributed widely by the MST, that it is necessary to break the spinal cord of the MST. This is a historic moment, this prosecutor's report said, the most important challenge since 1988, and 1988 was when electoral democracy after the dictatorship was restored in Brazil. That attempt at criminalization has involved the use of military police to break up squatting camps. As you saw on the televised report of the Congress, there are still 150,000 families on squatting camps organized by the MST. And while I was there, the military police invaded 3 of them. While I was there, while the meeting was going on. And when I heard that, only after the meeting was over, I had a day in Sao Paulo at the MST offices, I asked the delay, how could you be doing this? How could you be at a meeting like this where we're discussing these abstract questions while the military police is attacking MST squatter camps in Rio Grande do Sul? And he said, that's why the coffee breaks were so long. The implications of all of this for the MST are very severe, and they to some extent reflect its troubled relationship with the Lula government and the Workers' Party in general. For whatever criticisms they make of the Lula government, they invariably say that the one difference from Cardoso is that Lula, having been part of these kinds of protests as an auto worker himself in the transition from dictatorship in the 1980s, has refused, as Cardoso did, to send the army against the MST and their occupations. Refused to criminalize social movements, as they put it. And what they're awaiting is to see whether, although these have been state actions, whether the Lula government will intervene, and they have not yet, in what is happening in Rio Grande do Sul. But their difficulty with the Lula administration runs much deeper. Lula remains enormously popular, but promotes monoculture agricultural exports. As the MST puts it, he has not a single anti-capitalist policy, although he has many social policies. It's true, they say, that Lula has guaranteed for those MST settlements, where land has been legalized, has guaranteed prices, and the governments will buy the products they produce at guaranteed prices. On the other hand, the promised settlement of 100,000 families and the building of homes for them in 2002, which Lula ran on, and which his first agricultural development minister developed a plan for, has never been implemented. And that, of course, has a great deal to do with the Lula strategy of coping with the Brazilian economy in terms of giving priority to the balance of payments problem. And it has a great deal to do with the leadership Lula is providing to the G20, attempting to create what they call fairer trade. That is, the strategy of securing a Doha round, or a successor to it, which will open up northern markets in North America and Europe in particular, to Brazilian exports, agricultural exports. The effect of this, of course, will be in a country of some 200 million people. To orient agriculture where a great many are hungry and where redistribution of basic life elements is appallingly bad, it'll orient agriculture production to foreign markets, rather than to what the MST calls food sovereignty or food self-sufficiency. The defeat of the PT in Rio Grande do Sul is seen by the MST, which opened up the kind of right-wing government that is now trying to criminalize and legalize the MST. The defeat of the PT is, in that sense, seen as somewhat similar to the way in which the Ray government in Ontario paved the way for Harris. An equal fuck-up, if you want to put it that way. Now, Stedile's decision to call this meeting reflected this situation and his own approach to international solidarity. He has explained, since I've known him, since he first came to Toronto, and Judy was one of the people who brought him, David Langell and Carlos Torres were others, about 6 years ago, I think. He's from the beginning, since I first met him. I remember we were sitting at Mel's Diner and he was explaining this. He explains the disappointments of the Lula government in terms of the fact that there has been no movement from below in Brazil since the early 1990s. When he said that, someone at Mel's Diner at this breakfast we had said to him, "That's extremely interesting." Well, he couldn't believe it. The MST is saying there hasn't been real movement from below since the early 90s. Said, "That's very interesting, but you won't say this tonight at the big meeting at Oise, will you? It'll dispirit people." Stedile's politics is precisely to bring those kinds of problems to an international audience rather than romanticize what they're doing. And he does explain what has happened with Lula in terms of the inability of the movements to put pressure on the government, whether it's the CUT, which has moved, as everyone knows, to a very centrist and traditional bureaucratic union position, or whether it's the MST itself or other movements in Brazil. In other words, the attribution of the problem is self-reflective. At subsequent meetings, when Greg and I met him in Porto Alegre a few years later, when I interviewed him with Hillary Wainwright the year before that, and in his remarkable interview in this year's Socialist Register called The Class Struggles in Brazil, he lays this out very clearly. he argues, and this has become the official position of the MST, that Brazil has been in a downward phase of the class struggle for the past 15 years, 15, 16 years. And that the electoral success of Lula, to some extent, reflects this. It reflects a conservative electoral politics and electoral campaign. A electrical campaign which reflects both organizational weakness at the base and ideological weakness in the campaign. This made it eventually possible to get elected in the face of enormous media opposition, but it made it very difficult to do much once you got elected, in their view. So as you'll see if you read the interview in the Register, Stadile, while not breaking with the BT and not endorsing those explicitly who have broken with the BT, has been concentrating on building Via Campesina, the international organization of peasant movements, and taking on directly, as he puts it, Monsanto, Cargill, Coca-Cola, Nestle, and so forth, who he thinks provide a concentrated target against whom to fight. What is also clear, and he says this in the Register interview, is that he thinks that the Porto Alegre moment, the World Social Forum moment, is over, and no longer reflects a way to attempt to renew the struggle. At the same time, the meeting was organized as an attempt to help find a way out of the political impasse. The political impasse faced by the fact that this remarkable post-Leninist working class party that was built through the 1980s is now a conventional social democratic party. And if the conjuncture of the social movements is passed, of networking is passed, then the MST needs to find some way to negotiate the formation of a new political organization and its relationship to it. And that's why the meeting was called, as part of seeing this as part of a broader discussion that was needed in relation to the shifting conjuncture in Latin America. As he put it, a period of downturn in the class struggle can also be a period of rebuilding the left. And then he told a cute joke. It was a joke about a cat and a mouse, with a cat chasing a mouse through the house, and the mouse runs into a little mouse hole and breathes deeply and says, phew, and sits there for a few minutes and hears a bark. He says, ah, the dog has come. I can come out, I'm safe now. And he comes out and the cat is standing right there. The mouse looks at him shockingly, and the cat says, if you can't speak more than one language, you can't be competitive in today's globalized world. Okay, the first day of the meeting caught the spirit of the type of meeting was going to be, with a very, very sober introduction coming from Ana Esther Chichena, who also has a piece in this year's Register of UNAM in Mexico, the head of a research institute at the Autonomous University of Mexico, on the strength of the American empire and the strength of global capitalism. She showed, very impressively with overhead slides and data, the continuing strength of the U.S. portion of the top 500 multinational corporations, both in terms of their profitability and in terms of their increasing dominance of the proportion of industrial, commercial, and financial activity going on at a global scale. She showed, moreover, and I elaborated on this a bit at the meeting, because Rand had just published a report that I read about in The Economist on my way over there, that the American corporations are the world's leaders, continue to be the world's leaders, and extend their leadership in the leading R&D sectors, not least in biotechnology, where accumulation is going to take place through our genes. She showed how most of South America was connected to extensive projects of connecting extractive industries to world markets, but also showed the very extensive and major projects oriented to the industrial development of Latin America under the auspices of multinational corporations, still most of them American, especially in the equatorial regions of Latin America. She showed that both of these were linked to strategic projects of building ports that are the connective element to the world market, not only for merchandise, but also for getting military troops in as necessary on the southern points of the continent. She showed U.S. military dominance in the region, even though only 18 of the 827 U.S. military bases around the world in 2007 were in South America. She showed in terms of the location of these bases, with a new one being negotiated as she spoke in Peru, and in terms of smaller military installations right through the Latin American continent. These micro establishments, if you like, are closely linked, wherever they're located, to the strategic control of natural resources. And she concluded that the United States is still the space or the site for the coherence and concentration of international capital. Not only in the sense of U.S. territory, U.S. markets, Wall Street being that site, but also in the sense of those territories penetrated and occupied by U.S. corporations and the military around the world. And for those of you who know Sam's and my work, you know, I could have kissed her. It was the opening thing of the seminar, and one doesn't often hear, in the midst of all of the loose talk about capitalism in crisis in the United States and the American empire in decline, this type of very sober assessment of the strength of the enemy. And she concluded that we need a political perspective that reflects an understanding of this, and that can be widely disseminated culturally. This set the tone for a very useful discussion that avoided the usual crisis discussions so common on the left. That discussion didn't mean that there was any attempt to deny that there was an increasing problem of legitimacy or hegemony, if you like, for neoliberalism. On the contrary, it didn't deny that the Americans were very badly overstretched militarily in the Middle East. It didn't deny the current financial crisis that has its roots in the American mortgage market. But it saw this, almost all of the participants saw this, in terms of the opportunities it also provided for further integration through the management of these crises. Through the coordination that goes on in the management of these crises. As Eduardo Paz of Bolivia, who I'm going to tell you about in detail in a minute, put it, imperialism has effects of halting forces for change. Capitalism has learned much more than the left in this respect. Or as Fernando Martinez of Cuba put it, 40 years ago we were weak and didn't understand anything. Today we're just weak. We understand the solution is going to have to be political, not economic. And as Antonio Elias from Uruguay put it, neoliberalism has different phases. The Frente Amplio in Uruguay is not neoliberal ideologically, but it is in practice, as it puts union movements onto the defensive. And as Marcos Telos, the Mexican teacher that I had mentioned a couple of times, the teachers union put it, in terms of the correlation of forces. Is this a crisis for capitalism or for the working class, he asked. What are the potentials of the working class at this moment? Stadile summed up the discussion of this first day in the following way. We need to ask not whether it is a crisis, but what are the contradictions? It is clearly not yet a crisis. We need to make it such. We are in a cycle of defeat of the working class in Brazil. The working class is not challenging, but there are contradictions to work on, and he enumerated 6 of them. One was that the United States is spread too thin and can't rule directly, unlike the old empires. Secondly, that the local bourgeoisie has no national project any longer, and this has been a central theme of the MSP for a half dozen years. And that means that other than integration of itself and Brazil into the circuits of global capital, it is unable to develop a common national project that can gain legitimacy in Brazil. Thirdly, that accumulation is increasingly centered on the interest rates and fees of financial capital. And this produces a contradiction that workers feel directly, not just in terms of wage relations with their employers, but also in terms of the fact that an increasing portion of their wages is going to pay off credit. And in the Brazilian case, I had known this, as indeed a great many people who are middle class and even working class, if they have stable jobs, let us say in the auto industries, etc., are purchasing cars at an unbelievable rate. There are now 6 million cars on the streets of Sao Paulo. They're adding 1,000 cars a week to the streets of Sao Paulo. And they purchase these on the installment plan, with the credit payments taken directly from the paychecks, or increasingly commonly from the pensions of the workers that buy the car. So he argued that this produces a new way to reach workers in terms of a contradiction in the financialization of capitalism. He stressed, of course, as the MST does very centrally, the environmental contradiction, showing how capital's projects are in fact infeasible in light of those environmental contradictions. And especially insofar as industrial agriculture produces contaminated food. As he put it, we can appeal to people through their stomachs. Fifthly, capital does not have a project for integrating youth through stable employment. At least in Brazil, 5 million people between 14 and 28 are entirely outside of the school or the labor market in Brazil. And sixthly, he argued that cultural domination was increasingly, as he put it, styrofoam. It was styrofoam domination. That is, it has very few popular roots. As the Catholic Church lost its base amongst the pensions of the peasants and workers, and of course the MST grew very much out of the base communities of liberation theology in Brazil. But as the Catholic Church became increasingly conservative in the face of the mobilization by the MST, according to Stadile, it's increasingly lost its base. Not everyone agreed with this amongst peasants and workers. TV, he said, television, used to calm people down after the church no longer did so. But now young people, he argued, don't watch TV, they're playing games on the internet. This is a contradiction, a cultural contradiction, and thus an opportunity. Be that as it may. On the second day, we turn to analysis of the situation of the forces of the working class and the left. And Gustavo Codas of the CUT Research Department implicitly confronted and challenged Stadile on some aspects of his listing of contradictions. We need to recognize, he argued, that neoliberalism has changed both the ruling class and the working classes. The ruling class in Brazil used to buy domestically produced luxury products under import substitution industrialization. That was what was produced industrially inside Brazil. They would produce luxury products for those who could afford to buy them. Now they no longer do. They are consumers completely on the world market. The popular classes now are integrated into consumption, including of products produced by industry in Brazil through Brazil's remarkable industrialization that's taking place. And that reflects a degree of integration in neoliberalism. Moreover, the informal population is engaged in selling the cheap products produced on the world market. There's a new configuration of the working class, reflecting a crisis of the trade union movement. And Victor de Gennaro, who is head of the CTA union in Argentina, who was at the meeting, endorsed this and said there was a crisis of the old trade union model, which he in part attributed to the fact in Argentina that 67% of the disappeared in the 1970s were trade union militants. And that reflected an enormous loss of capacity on the part of the trade unions. But at the same time, he also argued that it reflected the remnants of old craft unionism and industrial unionism. And his union, the CTA, is rather famous for its campaign to organize individual workers, to bring them into the union as individuals, and then to help them, whether in terms of securing labor standards from the state, or whether in terms of organizing for an eventual certification. Marta Harnacker, who is a Chilean who has been working very closely with Chavez in the last 10 years or so, or at least 6 or 7 years, addressed this in terms of the way the working class has been reconfigured by the MNC's reorganization on the basis of what she called heterogeneous horizontal centralization, that is outsourcing to small production units, or direct production through the breaking up of big production units by these MNCs. With often, especially
What are
in
MMCs?
multinational corporations.
Okay.
With no rights especially for casual or part-time or informal workers. But she argued that especially in Chile, this is leading towards new forms of organization by workers, very different from the classical class struggles, trade union struggle, a century ago. That is, subcontracted workers are coming together in Chile using direct actions such as blocking highways and railroads and construction sites, and learning in this way, using those kinds of tactics, as she put it, to negotiate with Tarzan, not with the monkeys. The monkeys being the subcontracted businesses, as in Tarzan being the multinational corporation. But it's recognized, and it was recognized by almost everyone at the meeting, that to do this effectively, to engage in this kind of strategy effectively, you needed a very different kind of government than the Chilean social democratic government is. You needed support for this type of action and legislation that allowed organization of this kind. And out of that came a discussion of the three types of governments that now exist in Latin America. The mainstream center-right governments that are pro-free trade, that are neoliberal, that are oriented to integration into the world market on world market's own terms. The second type of government, what Castaneda calls the good left, that is capital's left, the social democratic left, the left in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. And the bad left of Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and some would add Ecuador. And most of the discussion, fascinatingly, was not about the good left, not about the social democratic left and its limitations. It was about the limitations and contradictions of what capital sees as the bad left, what we would define as the good left. It didn't dwell on what was wrong with Lula, on what was wrong with the Chilean Social Democrats, on what was wrong with the Argentinian Peronists. It dwelled on the limitations in Brazil, in Venezuela, and so on, in Bolivia. And the general principles adduced, as far as I could tell, was that amongst what we would call the good left, where they were in government, there was a lack of trust of social forces from below. There was organizational ineffectiveness from inside the state, and there were authoritarian tendencies. The main test of all of this was in terms of, do they foster mobilization of the masses? Do they foster human development? And do they foster the autonomy of the base? I.e., as one person put it, mobilization without substitutionism. Attilio Boron offered a set of very practical measures. Is there a really serious tax reform? And secondly, is there an agrarian reform that will yield food sovereignty? And he argued that revolutionary processes start with these types of reforms. He offered the example of the Bolshevik Revolution with its slogan, peace, land, and peace. Sorry, bread, land, and peace. And he said the same was for the Cuban Revolution, that the national liberation struggle began with, and when it came to power in '59, with the program of going back to the Constitution of 1940. It was the dialectic of class struggle that gave rise to the revolution as the attempt to realize those goals was put in motion. And insofar as that did happen, it was because movements like that treated class alliances as tactical rather than as fundamentally strategic. Marta Harnecker responded by saying that bread, land, and peace is a slogan, not a program. And it was for the Bolsheviks. That the Bolsheviks had a program, a much more radical program for agricultural reform in mind, but in order to win support from the peasantry, they ended up with a much more modest one. This then led, and this was an inevitable introduction, to a discussion of what is taking place in Bolivia today. And it was led by Eduardo Paz, who, as I said, has been active in the government and is a professor at the University of La Paz. And it's really worth, I think, me laying it out for you, even though it'll take a few minutes. He argued the open by saying we need to develop the capacity to think endogenously, to develop our own concept reflecting our own reality. We need to differentiate between popular democracy and then one that is imposed on us. In Bolivia, we are living through a process of electoral elitism. A series of constant voting, 7 or 8 elections, are on the agenda that gets away from the popular insurrection of 2003. This then gives rise to a series of electoral mediations led by Morales' 53% victory in the 2005 election. But this apparent blank check of such a great electoral victory is now increasingly conditioned by further electoral struggles, by further what he called electoral elitism, being held in the referenda this year in particular, in the various regions and in regional elections. All of which are promoted and dominated by the oligarchies in the region to legitimate their power by winning support for greater regional autonomy against the central government and against change, i.e. to weaken the Morales government via revocatory referenda in each department, province, or state, where it will be decided whether the governors will continue or not, and these governors have led the campaigns against the Morales national government. The Bolivian process since 2005, since the Morales victory in other words, has been characterized by a process of ups and downs, he argued. He identified 2 ups, the nationalization of gas and the call for a constituent assembly and a winning of 52% of the allies of the Morales government at that constituent assembly. But he listed a series of downers. 1, there were 2 traps that assembly fell into. It could only make decisions with 2/3 of the votes, which was planned by the oligarchic intellectuals to ensure that the Bolivian right would be able to hold power in the country via freezing the constitutional process. And that's in fact what was happening, even though the Morales allies had over 50% of the vote in the Constituent Assembly. A second downer was that Petrobras from Brazil and Total from Spain and France have managed to convert the gas nationalization to a program of new controls that give more revenues to the Brazilian government, but does not allow it to control the key investment, production, and export decisions. The third downer was that by giving revenues from these increased resources to regional governors, as part of Morales' program for greater autonomy and decentralization, by giving increased revenues to the regions, this has given them the ability to mobilize people, especially students from the right, in support of the local oligarchic sectors. This involves an exacerbation of racial divisions in Bolivia, which has its roots in Spanish colonialism between white and the mixed Indian population, whereby even the traditional left sectors have been marked by this.
And from this comes the student reaction today, which is very clearly racist in Bolivia. As seen in Sucre, when indigenous supporters of Morales were forced to take off their clothes and march naked through the square. The Morales government gave the regional governors the resources to allow the right wing to mobilize the students. His assessment today is as follows. The transnational companies have not left the country and continue to have control over foreign trade. The large mining corporations, especially from Canada, Argentina, and Japan, including one with George Soros as a partner, have not been touched by the government. The financial system has not been touched, and it engages in speculation, which is increasingly harmful. The landlord classes have not been dispossessed, but have rather been strengthened, as they've armed themselves with militias and trafficked in arms and are ready to confront, increasingly ready to confront the government. Many sectors of the middle classes who bet on Morales in 2005 are being converted by the media campaign against him 24 hours a day to say he is a puppet of Chavez in Cuba. Ironically, Venezuela needs to do much more than it's doing to establish a state oil company that could counter the power of the MNCs. Above all, the government needs to use cadres that are committed to the project rather than to use, as it is increasingly doing, technocrats from the central bank who are still committed to some variant of the neoliberal project. The challenge, as he put it, is to form a political cadre in the public administration. The Bolivarian project cannot go further without linking to Venezuela, Uruguay, etc., in a common process leading to a socialist United States of Latin America. In private conversation with Paz, he said some very interesting things about the situation with the church and the army. The Catholic Church had been supportive of the even Trotskyist-led miners. One very famous priest who had campaigned with them is now leading a campaign against the Morales government on the grounds that Morales is interfering with religious education in public schools. The army situation is extremely delicate. Morales apparently negotiated with great subtlety the removal of the American security and intelligence apparatus, and they're embedded in every Latin American army, from the Brazilian army. And this was accepted by the Bolivian generals, now, however, with the increasing mobilizations in the regions, the army sees its responsibility as that of protecting national unity, and they're doing so not only with regard, above all, to the state of Santa Cruz in the east, but also coming very explicitly out against the autonomy for indigenous communities. He thinks that it's extremely likely that, and dangerous, that the United States could induce the army to engage in a reactionary intervention against Morales. So that was a very sobering report. And one was so interesting because it was placed in the context of a discussion of previous revolutionary successes on the part of governments that were undertaking reforms of a kind not all that different from the limited nationalization of the gas companies that Morales has been able to undertake. But with, at the moment, a different dynamic in terms of the configuration of class forces going on. This led to a more general debate about the type of political project that needed now to be launched in the new conjuncture, beyond Bolivia or Venezuela. With debates taking place over whether to stress being anti-neoliberal in such a project or being anti-capitalist, with a consensus that the most important thing was to build the types of political organizations that were capable of developing popular power from the bottom up, through electoral campaigns, for instance, that were not, which were seen as pedagogical rather than in terms of selling products. I have at the back some electoral propaganda that was used in the Lugo campaign in Paraguay, where militants from that campaign argued that that type of propaganda was, in fact, pedagogical. And you can see it, its passports and boarding passes and so on, that attempts to deal with the migration crisis. With special attention being paid, and this was very interestingly raised by Claudia Correll from Argentina, a journalist from Argentina, with special attention being paid to capitalist discipline of everyday life. Cultural domination, she argued, involves repressing bodies as well as dreams and hopes. And in this light, the left needed to be very careful now of an alliance with the Catholic Church, which does not allow a creative alliance against this kind of discipline as regards women, youth, etc. But this notion that we need to build socialism in everyday life was present through the meeting. If it was going to be possible to defeat the oligarchic democracy on its own terrain through elections and legality, rather than through an insurrectionary strategy, which was almost entirely missing from the discussion. It was argued that we need to recognize that there are no good theoretical sources on how to solve the party-state problem, both in terms of how to get to state power and in terms of how to transform it when you get there. And it was argued that this absence applies even more to getting there via elections than it does via an insurrectionary strategy. Since when you are able to take the state through an insurrectionary strategy, you can treat yourself as God. You've gotten there by already defeating the opposition forces. When you get there via the electoral strategy, it becomes much more difficult as you establish constituent assemblies, try to change the constitution, have to find alliances, etc., etc. And that leads to all kinds of possibilities of treating alliances as strategic rather than tactical. And that led to a debate, a few more points on this because it summarized the whole meeting. That led to a debate on whether the focus of organization should be territorial, that is, based on neighborhoods, departments, or whether it should be occupational and based on the most immediate definition of class. And the latter is, of course, very popular in light of the importance of indigenous movements and their struggle for autonomy in Latin America as part of this new conjuncture. In either case, it was argued that the difficult thing was to preserve autonomy as you articulated the base with a party, and even more so with the government. The trouble with the communal councils in Venezuela, a number of people argued, is that they are each channeled via Chavez and to Chavez. Not that they aren't engaged and there isn't a genuine mobilization there, but that each of them is channeled to Chavez rather than building an organically unified subject. Marta Harnacker argued that that may be true, yet Chavez sees his role, and it is a necessary role, as protecting the communal councils against local mayors and local oligarchs at the community level. And if they weren't being channeled directly to Chavez, they wouldn't have this capacity. This is often defined as clientelism, which she thinks is unfair given the balance of forces in each community. They're dependent on Chavez in order to build their community power. Above all, the discussion tried to address the question of how to pass from the previous conjuncture to the current one through the articulation of social movements together to form some new form of political organization. How do you do that in such a way that doesn't involve treating the social movements as though they were political parties, which they're not and they can't be? And the example was given in Uruguay, for instance, of the mistake of trying to treat the unions as though they were political parties, rather than a field of struggle in which political parties are engaged in trying to develop activists and leadership. And then even if they do, face the enormous difficulty, much more than unions do, of trying to activate the mass of the workers that they lead in a political way. That is, he said, we're able to mobilize them for one big action a year, one big strike, a one-day strike a year. But beyond that, that's the limit of our ability to actually get the masses to act in the trade union movement. Above all, and this is how it concluded, we need to recognize that the working class does not exist. The working class is not found ready-made in a factory. It is something that is constructive, that is self-constructive. It is not something that is simply there. The diversity of workers is a fact. What is needed is to create working classes in a way that reflects that diversity, while not breaking it into 1,000 pieces and not succumbing to the damages of identity politics. Recognizing that we need to reorganize the class in a very fundamental way, now that it has been changed so much over the course of the past century by capitalism and by neoliberalism. But if we agree that there is a crisis of bourgeois democracy as a result of neoliberalism emptying its substance out of it, then we are obliged to build our own political spaces. If we don't do this, we will not be able to break the inertia of the old system. And the meeting concluded with Stadile summarizing many of these points that I just did from this final discussion on the third day. As he said it, the intention of the seminar was not to come to conclusions, not to produce documents, but to provide space for the key political discussion of our time. In any case, class struggles in the coming years will require us to adjust the insights generated at this seminar. And what were these insights? And without repeating the ones I just summarized, he, I think, concentrated on the following number of them. One, we are entering a new conjuncture which will be more favorable for the working class because neoliberalism and bourgeois democracy are losing legitimacy. And that includes the loss of legitimacy by social democratic parties and governments that have embraced neoliberalism. We can take advantage of the contradictions that he enumerated on the first day in terms of environmental, consumerist, and other contradictions, above all agriculture, he would have stressed. And that is creating the subjective conditions that is making the possibility of the mobilization and reorganization of the working class more possible than it's been for a very long time in this cycle of class struggles. And because Latin America is living in a new period with a new correlation of forces, it can be a reference point for other countries and for building the international solidarity that is necessary in this new conjunction. The challenge, as he summarized it, is to develop political instruments which are adequate to building on this conjuncture. The left must enter into a new type, a new phase of organization building to overcome what he called social movementism. To build political movements that are more than social forums and more than networking. To face the internal challenges regarding those organizations. That will require strengthening and stimulating social struggles of all kinds through the formations of cadres that are not only good at winning elections and running governments, but are good at mobilizing social struggles. Using electoral victories to accumulate criticism of our own organizations and practices. To continue to combine electoral victories with economic and cultural struggles at the base, so as to use governments to develop popular capacities. And internationally to accumulate the social forces, including by critiquing each other, and that was his last point. And he ended by critiquing Lula for sending troops to Haiti on the grounds that Brazilian soldiers shoot less accurately than Yankee soldiers. With that, he said he was sorry that he had to end the meeting at this end of the third day, but some people had to fly out of Sao Paulo, which was 27 kilometers away. The traffic in Sao Paulo was part of the dehumanization of capitalism that prevents people from using their time more productively. Okay, that's it.